My name is Giulio Stefanini. I'm an interventional cardiologist working at Humanitas Research Hospital in Milan, Italy. The POEM study is a prospective single-arm study aiming at addressing the safety of the Synergy bioresorbable polymer-coated everolimus-eluting stent, followed by 1 month of dual antiplatelet therapy in patients at high bleeding risk. Mainly to address this aim, what we did was to recruit prospectively patients at high bleeding risk with coronary artery disease who presented at several Italian centers, actually 9 centers, to undergo PCI, and they underwent PCI with the implantation of a Synergy everolimus-eluting stent. And after the PCI, the patients were recruited and discharged with an antithrombotic strategy based on the concept of a short DAPT of 1 month only. To be recruited, patients had to be at high bleeding risk, meaning that they had to have at least 1 high bleeding risk criteria. And the antithrombotic strategy was based on, as I said, 1 month DAPT. In patients needing for oral anticoagulation, well, these patients had an antithrombotic strategy based on a P2Y12 inhibitor, plus the oral anticoagulation for 1 month. And beyond the first month, they continued with oral anticoagulation or only dropping the P2Y12 inhibitor. Whereas patients who did not require oral anticoagulation, well, those underwent a 1 month DAPT based on aspirin and a P2Y12 inhibitor. After the first month, they dropped the P2Y12 inhibitor, continuing on aspirin only. Patients were followed up to 1 year. The primary endpoint was the composite of cardiac death, myocardial infarction, or definite probable stent thrombosis at 1 year. And the study was powered for non-inferiority compared with an objective performance criteria derived by the available safety outcomes of the polymer-free bioresorbable stents, the LEADERS-3 trial. The study was prematurely interrupted after the inclusion of 443 patients, mainly due to slow recruitment. The patients included were at high bleeding risk, but also high ischemic risk, if you look at the baseline risk profile. With respect to the antithrombotic strategy, the compliance with the discharge therapy was very high. So we truly are talking about a high bleeding risk population discharged with 1 month DAPT who actually underwent only 1 month of dual antiplatelet therapy. And with respect to the primary endpoint at 1 year, so the composite of cardiac death, MI, or definite probable stent thrombosis, this occurred in 4.8% of patients at 1 year, mainly demonstrating the non-inferiority, which was the primary hypothesis of the study, with a P for non-inferiority below 0.001. Since the study was prematurely interrupted, so with lower than planned number of patients, we performed a post-hoc power calculation, which showed that despite having recruited a lower number of patients, we still have a statistical power above 90% to show our primary hypothesis. Looking at the secondary outcomes, so mainly ischemic and bleeding outcomes, actually the rates were very favorable, very low in this patient population. So we can conclude mainly saying, based on this evidence, that in HBR patients, high bleeding risk patients, undergoing PCI with the Synergy everolimus-eluting stent and undergoing 1 month DAPT, well, the study showed non-inferior ischemic outcomes of this strategy as compared with a pre-specified objective performance criteria. And also, we showed very low rates of ischemic and bleeding events in this study, and therefore very reassuring regarding the application of a 1-month dual antiplatelet therapy in high bleeding risk patients, in patients treated with this device. The key conclusions of the study are that in HBR patients undergoing PCI with a Synergy bioresorbable polymer-coated everolimus-eluting stent, a 1-month dual antiplatelet therapy regimen resulted in non-inferior ischemic outcomes as compared to a specified objective performance criteria and very low rates of ischemic and bleeding events. The implications for clinical practice are that we can safely use the Synergy device in HBR patients requiring a very short DAPT. So we start having evidence of a number of devices. We started with the bioresorbable polymer-free stent, the BioFreedom in the Leaders 3 trial. Then this was extended to the Resolute Onyx in the Onyx 1 study, which was showed non-inferior to the BioFreedom in the Onyx 1 trial. And now we also have evidence on the Synergy everolimus-eluting stent, which again was showed non-inferior to the objective performance criteria based on the Leaders 3 trial. So we start having sufficient evidence to inform us that we can use safely the Synergy everolimus-eluting stent in HBR patients requiring 1-month dual antiplatelet therapy. So the next steps, well, I think it's a very interesting question. On my point of view, the next step would be to evaluate different antiplatelet regimens in these patients, mainly an extended monotherapy, which could start already earlier than 1 month, or which could be based on a P2Y12 inhibitor only instead of aspirin, since our patients after the first month discontinued the P2Y12 inhibitor, continuing instead an aspirin monotherapy. What I think is that it could be interesting in this HBR population to evaluate the, let's say, chronic secondary prevention strategy with a P2Y12 inhibitor only, particularly after the publication of the host exam just last week in The Lancet, in the occasion of the ACC scientific meetings, which indeed suggested that there might be an advantage with such strategy instead of aspirin alone.